Welcome to Hope Blooms, a podcast from the Early Pregnancy Loss Association.
At EPLA, we seek to support women and families suffering early pregnancy loss by providing resources, education, and community. It is our vision that no one suffers miscarriage alone. Welcome back to Hope Blooms. This is Emily Carrington, and I am excited to be here again with Heidi and Ben Kafferlin. Maria is here with me too, and we are going to pick up where we left off for part 2 with Heidi and Ben's story. In our last episode, we talked about the physical experience and the medical trauma that Heidi experienced, and we want to pick up that conversation with then the days, weeks, months, and years afterwards. We know this isn't just a physical burden, but an emotional and sometimes a relational burden. And everyone experiences that very differently. And so welcome back, Heidi and Ben. We are so glad to have you.
Thank you.
Well, go ahead and tell us sort of, you've said you've experienced it very differently. Can you give us a little bit about what that meant?
Well, so for me, it was pretty quick. Like we noted in the last episode, as the EMT brain was kind of what was on during most of the whole experience at the ambulance ride and everything.
He was in the front seat in the ambulance. He wasn't even in the back with me.
So anyway, I was just, I don't know, kind of, I put it in a box like a good guy, right? And
your waffle brain.
Yep, exactly.
Versus the spaghetti brain.
Oh, yeah. I haven't heard that for a long time.
So I didn't even really start to process it, I don't think, until the next day. And I remember thinking we were just sitting on the couch after dinner or something 24 hours later, which was when I finally had stopped distracting myself with work and just stuff. And kind of just sat there for 5 minutes thinking and finally burst out crying. And Heidi, I felt
guilty because I wasn't in the same stage emotionally.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you said something that was really insensitive, like, why are you crying? Or something.
Nothing happened. What was your grief? Was it for your wife, for the baby, for just whatever just happened to you? Or
I don't think it was exactly grief for Heidi's pain or anything. It was mainly over, we had this expectation of having a baby, and it was kind of the death of the expectation. But also I think just that overarching realization of sin and awfulness in the world, and just kind of lamenting the ugliness of this world.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing how that, all it takes is one thing, and then suddenly you're overwhelmed with everything is terrible and they'll never be the same again. I mean, that's how I felt in those moments. Nothing will ever be the same ever, and never good again.
The gates of hell have been opened.
Yes. And it's so overwhelming. And so maybe then it was helpful that since you were in different places, you had someone there to be like, no, wait, it'll be okay. But
yeah, I'm not known for my tact in situations like that. I don't remember saying that, but...
And those probably weren't the exact words, but I will tell you that that's how whatever you said, that's how it
came
felt.
across. Well, and I felt guilty because I wasn't distraught. At any point, I wasn't distraught. I had a few tears a couple weeks later when I was actually creating the Facebook post about it, and the writing of what was... expressing myself through writing always helps me process a little bit. And so when I posted that, that's when I was, felt the weight of that grief. And it was short lived, but in the first few days, we have a good friend. So the wife of the guy who first responded from the fire department, that was the first voice I heard when I woke up from being unconscious. They are staff at a Christian camp near us where I used to work, and he was my boss. And so when I first woke up and heard his voice, I felt a lot of reassurance. And then in the days following that, his wife really stepped in. Her name is Tanya. She had a very similar miscarriage experience. So she showed me a lot of love in those, and she texted me every day. She came over the next day and sat with me and talked to me. And then after that, for like a week or two, she texted me every single day. And one thing she said to me when she came over was, it's difficult to grieve someone you've never met. And that was exactly where I was at. I was like, I don't even know where to start in terms of processing this, because it wasn't someone I had hardly enough time to process the fact that I was actually pregnant. There was no baby that I could feel. I wasn't even in my fat pants. Like, it was like, it was just not real to me yet. So
that probably has something to do with why I was processing it so much faster.
yes,
Namely, I could see a little girl already. Like, I already had the visions I wanted. Like, I had the name. I had, frankly, that little girl in my mind looks a lot like our daughter, who,
yeah,
Eva.
Yeah. So I guess that's why I didn't process it more quickly. But now having a 1-year-old or 16-month-old, when I got that, and the other thing that Tanya said was that sometimes once you already have children, that it's easier for you to process that grief because you know what you're missing and you know what you're grieving. Whereas I didn't. So that helped put my mind at ease, and at least helped me not feel guilty. So like this year when I pulled that ornament out and put it on the tree, I felt more of the weight of what we had lost because of the joy that we have with our current little girl.
I think that's probably more common than we think. And I think that and even if you do feel it right away, I think there's sort of an easiness to be sort of separated from that grief, and that it is kind of hard. You've never met them, your family hasn't met them. And I think there's something too. I know I sort of have a special connection with other babies that are or they're not babies now, other 8 and 9-year-olds that would be around the age of my baby. And sort of, it's now kind of a happy, like, touch point. I was due at the same time as my sister-in-law, which we've talked about in other episodes. And
yeah, we have a really good friend who, once they heard we were pregnant, they tried to get pregnant afterwards. And were successful. And so their little boy is about the same age that our baby would have been. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's what I think when I see him too.
Oh, I forgot. She called me on the way to the hospital.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And said, hey, guess what? We're pregnant. And I answered the phone because I thought that she knew somehow, or was, whatever. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
Right.
And did you tell her where you were going, or did it just not?
Yeah,
did you just say, "Oh wow,
we're not anymore"?
Oh, I bet she felt terrible, but oh well.
Right. And those are right, and that's part of this huge process too. Like, let's talk about that a little bit in the processing. You guys had started to tell people. We had not told anyone out of the You
know what? Even now, looking back, I'm glad we told people, because with Ben's position, so the first thing he did when he went back to work, he was off work for two days. And then Friday morning he went back to work. And the first thing he did was he had a radio interview with some local, some newscasters who came down from Erie, and they were just doing a promo for local tourism or whatever. And the local radio host who knew us had heard that we were going to have a baby. And so one of the news anchors from Erie was not there because his wife had just had a baby. And so Dale, the radio host, turns to Ben and said, turns to Ben and says, Ben, I hear you're headed down that road. And he didn't have, it was live radio. He didn't have a choice. And so actually it was a really cool opportunity for Ben to, express what had happened and how wonderful our community had been in coming around us, and our church, the body of Christ, and the church that came around us, and really enveloped us and cared for us. And so Ben came home later that day and said, I'm so sorry. I had no choice. We were live. I was kind of backed into a corner, and I hope this isn't hurtful to you. And I was like, no, I'm so glad that we were able to. And then later, so not only was it live radio, it was on a Facebook live feed. So there were people who knew us from across the county who started commenting and saying, thank you for what you said. I have my own story, and this, was really encouraging to me or whatever. And there were just things that came out of it that I never, ever would have imagined.
Well, and that's a thing we talk about a lot with our organization is sort of the change in attitude or social script from you don't talk about it to it's okay to talk about it if you want to. And it's sort of a more, commonly discussed in the open thing. And yet with mine, I hadn't told anyone except my parents and my in-laws. And so then I told my students that I had the flu, and that's why I wasn't coming to work. And I regretted that later, that I wouldn't just be upfront and, if I had been honest, would people have been able to, say, hey, it happened to me too, or here's what I found helpful or anything like that. So
or bring you some soup,
right.
It's
right.
We've talked about this in other episodes. Yeah, we didn't tell. And so I tried to lie, and then everyone was like, that's silly. And,
Yeah.
I don't think she's sick. I just saw her half an hour ago, and I was really thankful that we ended up telling people, that it was helpful, and we had mostly the prayers and support we needed. We hadn't told, it was still sort of this weird, and I think things have changed. I know my perspective has changed. People now just tell me. I know that there's a
that just because you didn't tell people you're pregnant doesn't mean you can't tell them that you had a miscarriage.
Right, exactly.
Right.
So, but and it was still sort of this like secret, right? There was sort of this dynamic of the people who knew and the people who didn't know, and that we needed to be discreet. And I really just, I was a lot more open in later losses, and it was a lot easier to navigate when it wasn't this weird.
Yeah. And it gave us a connection with people that I never would have thought. So there's a local police chief of a small municipality near us. And we were there, I don't know, it was around Christmas time later.
It was months later.
Yeah, it was months later. It was a few months later. And it was even on my mind. We were at this open house for this new police station that they had built. And so Ben and I went in, and we're talking to all these people, from the community that we know. And the police chief pulls me into the side room. And I didn't even know he was a Christian because I had only seen him in an official capacity before. He pulls me into the side room, and he's crying. And he was like, I just want to let you know, I'm so sorry for you. We have a couple of babies buried in the cemetery like a mile from here. And, my wife and I have been praying for you, and we know we've been there. And I was like, oh my goodness, what a cool connection with someone that I never would have had before. And ever since then, like, it's given a connection with people who have been in the same place too.
So it's a two-way street, I guess. Not only by everyone knowing where we be able to be ministered to when we needed it, but it has opened up the opportunity for us to minister to others.
And that's very scriptural. That's talked about in Corinthians where Paul talks about, comforting others with the comfort that God has comforted you. And that passage is very real in times like that. And so I've had lots of opportunity to be an encouragement to other women who have been in the same boat.
So how did that, let's go back to the two of you, but you're walking through that together and taking care of each other as you're processing this in a very different way. Once you got past criticizing Ben for crying.
So early on in our marriage, I feel like if it happened now, it would play out a lot differently in caring for each other. And I don't think there was a lot. Like it's not like we didn't talk about it, but we definitely processed it differently and separately. And I think it would be less separate if it were now. Do you agree?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think we had learned yet how to flesh something like that out as a married couple.
Right. You think when you get married, like, we've been through everything and we know everything about each other. And then years later, you're like, oh no, we definitely didn't.
and we were in between. We were still trying to find a church to plant in, to to plant ourselves in. So I think if we had been in a church body more closely, we may have had more input and counsel in that vein. I don't think there's been any collateral damage from that, from the lack of processing it together. But I could see in the future.
We'll talk about that later.
Yeah.
I don't mean to air your marriage here, but I do think there's something.
You want to air?
I think there's something that, giving space to work through those hard things. However it is, I mean, we worked through things. We'd been married for almost five years at our loss, and hadn't really been through anything too hard yet, but had still done 5 years of marriage, and had moved to Texas, and were there was a lot of our own little island of making, and there's different ways you process. There's different comforts you hold on to, and I think that's something, and realizing that both are suffering and experiencing loss, and to give space to that can be hard. And unfortunately, trauma and loss can be really hard on a marriage, so it's, I don't know that I have any more advice other than, you weather those things together.
Yeah.
Right?
I guess the other side of that coin is, if it happened now, we would very actively seek the counsel of our church family and those in leadership in the church over us, because that is very, biblical. So,
did you guys do anything to we talk a lot about like ways to process grief, and this is different for everyone. I know I felt really like paralyzed, like I don't know what to do to process my grief, and someone, just said, release a balloon, which wasn't really going to be my cup of tea for processing grief, but just the idea of doing something made me realize that, like, oh, so we didn't have the remains, we weren't able to do burials, but we did, small prayer services, and recognized and made some memory boxes and stuff like that, and have ornaments. Are there things you guys did or didn't do or wish you had done that helped or didn't help?
We planted a little willow tree in our front yard near the front of our driveway where there's a lot of water, and we had talked about planting a willow tree there in the past because that helps with water issues in a yard. And so we found one like way marked down at Lowe's, because in September Lowe's puts all their plants, on super sale. And so we found one, and it was just perfect. And we told the guy what it was for, and he marked it down even more. And so we brought home this willow tree and planted it. And that was very, like, we took a picture, and that was a very, like, poignant moment of, we're doing this for this. And that's when I made the Facebook post about it. And so that was more of a point in time for me of processing.
I think that's something good for that. As you said, you didn't cry much. It wasn't till you made the Facebook post. As someone cut from a similar cloth, I think though those outward markers, even if you're not like emotionally experiencing it right yet, or whatever sort of like worked up feelings, which are totally legitimate, moving through the grief in those ways is still a processing through the grief.
Right. And I would make the distinction that I think our society puts a lot of weight on feelings and what you outwardly express, as opposed to more of a scriptural mindset of strengthening your inner man and your spiritual maturity throughout that process, and moving forward after that. I think that's more.
Well, it seems like so much, what the world considers like real sharing of emotions is not. It's like what you put on Instagram.
Right.
Right. Like, I'm feeling this way. It's like, but you're not really, because that's just for show. It's a totally different thing.
Yeah. I think there's gotta be room for that. I know we've talked in previous episodes, I think just a couple episodes, about being gentle. And I did eventually, get to a point where I was outwardly expressing. It was just a very sort of like passionate wailing, essentially. So there is that side of that, and you've got to give space for that. But there's also this side of it, and you're not going to feel like that. And those feelings don't legitimize or delegitimize your experience at all, or your grief. So I'm sorry, Maria, I interrupted you again. You have a question.
Oh, that's okay. I just had one more quick, angle that we could discuss briefly before we wrap up. Was there, because this happened with me, was there sort of a resurgence, or what were the emotions like when then you did either try to conceive again or succeeded? Because it sounds like me, and I think like Emily, the losses were our first pregnancies. And so then you're going into pregnancy like only knowing this negative potential outcome. What was it like then going forward?
Yeah, I was just a little bit more cautious, I guess. But I felt like after the miscarriage, my body regulated much better than it had ever been before. So I felt much more healthy hormonally in terms of my cycle. And so I felt like, I don't know, as I recall, I remember feeling like, oh, maybe this pregnancy will be successful because I'm more well regulated now. I don't remember.
Well, that's true, but you were also...
Maybe what I verbalized was more cautious.
You were very standoffish.
Yeah.
Well, it's sort of terrifying if you're like, if this is what pregnancy means, then I don't want it, right? Like that's sort of how I felt. I both wanted to immediately try to have another one, but then also was like, I can't go through that again, even though it wasn't guaranteed that I would have to go through that again, I
don't know that that's how Heidi expressed her feeling. It was more of a desire to take control again. So the first pregnancy was not a surprise, or not, it wasn't surprising or unsurprising, I guess, because we weren't intending to get pregnant, but we were also not intending to
not
be pregnant.
preventing it.
Whereas then, once that happened, she took a very strict kind of, we're controlling this now, and I'm not going to be pregnant right now. And it took a long time for kind of...
Oh, I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I think there's a way. I mean, this could be a whole other podcast here, but I think I was really shocked by, I've said this before, I wanted a big family. I wanted an appropriately Protestantly large family, 3 to 5 children. You know what I like? But I realized, I really thought that well, let's not get into how I thought that would just please God, that I wanted to control that. But I really did think I had bought into sort of all worldviews, and that this was something I could control. I could choose not to have babies, and then I could choose to have babies. So I always thought people just chose to not have babies.
Yeah, I think once we were okay, or I was okay with trying for a baby again, and once I thought I might be pregnant again, I was very, very hesitant to get my hopes up. I purposely didn't get my hopes up, and was very blasé about pregnancy tests and everything, because I just didn't want to get emotionally invested if this was going to happen all over again.
Right. Right.
So, and I went to a different OB office.
Oh, good.
After yeah, I was not going to see that doctor again. And they saw me early on and did an early ultrasound, because just to make sure and just to see if everything was going okay. And sure enough, our little Eva was kicking and strong from the very beginning.
And by the way, was born 2 years and 2 days.
2 days after the miscarriage.
Oh, wow.
Those things are crazy and wonderful. I think, what point in your pregnancy with her did you sort of realize that she was coming? That she was for real?
When my fat jeans didn't fit anymore.
Hey, that is earlier. I was holding Abigail in my arms when I was we had a baby today.
Oh, wow.
That morning, the nurse said, we're having a baby today. And I said, we are? So, No, we're not. That's not how this ends. I didn't think anything bad was going to happen. I just didn't have any concept that a baby was going to happen. Well, Heidi and Ben, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I think this is really important for people to hear different stories and different perspectives and just how we all work through it. So I really want to thank you for giving us the time on these last 2 episodes.
For sure. I think in retrospect, I would say don't underestimate the opportunities for being blessed and for ministering to other people in that trial. Something that I didn't expect, but was very blessed by. And I would encourage healthcare professionals not to be dismissive of people either.
Yeah, I think that's important. Well, thank you very much. And we are
grateful for you coming.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for listening to Hope Blooms, a podcast from the Early Pregnancy Loss Association.
To learn more about how we and you can support women suffering early pregnancy loss, visit our website at miscarriagecare.com or find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you for listening.